Hello, and welcome to the Better Dental Life podcast, where we speak with extraordinary individuals who inspire us by showing us new possibilities and shattering our limiting beliefs. On this podcast, we don't just talk about better smiles, we talk about better lives. I'm your host, Mark Davis. All right, welcome to another episode of the Better Dental Life podcast. I'm very excited to introduce my guest, Dr. Darin O'Bryan. Dr. O'Brien's been a practice owner for many years in Coos Bay, Oregon. He owns O'Bryan Advanced Dentistry. He's also lectured and taught as a faculty member of CEREC, speaks in many dental meetings. And I've known Darin for a number of years because he introduced me really to the CDocs world. So Darin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. They say it's been actually it's been over a decade easily.
Yeah, it has been a bit.
Right.
Yep. Right. So yeah, you were training in CEREC, and actually you opened the door for me to do some of that. So you said, "Hey, I'm sick of traveling all the way to Southern Oregon. How about you train some of these guys for me?"
Especially in the wintertime, trying to go up the passes. I'm like, right. No, I'm good.
Like, why don't you do some of the training, please?
Right.
And that was kind of neat because that, I felt a little bit like, oh, what am I doing? I just barely got my CEREC and started training people. But yeah, that's how amazing CDocs was. That got you up to speed quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how I got introduced to it. People threw me out there in the front of it all first. You know, when I first started coming on, people like Rich and Sam and those guys were, "Hey, you need a lecturer. Here's who you need to get. You should hire Darin." And that's so I always want. And Rich and I worked on that a lot, where we were trying to pay it forward. You know, see the people who had talent, who were good at it, who had the skill set to teach it and communicate it well, and ship them out there.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. It was a lot of fun for me, and it just more than anything else, just introduced me to a world and a group of people that changed my life, changed my practice. So it was pretty fantastic for me.
Yeah, it's amazing how it alters your life and your professional life and personal life. I mean, some of my best friends are now people I met through CDocs. Yeah, I'm going to a bachelor party here in about 2 months for one of the other owners in Imagine, Mike Snyder. You know.
Oh yeah.
Bird.
Yep.
We've been friends for over a decade, seen their kids grow up, gone on vacation with people, and now we're seeing them getting married again. And yeah, it's crazy.
That's good. Yeah, I love that. So I want to step way back when you just first started thinking about dentistry. What got you into the profession?
So it's funny because everybody was like, "Well, was your dad a dentist?" Nobody in my family was a dentist, and I kind of knew I wanted to go into medicine because my aunt was a physician. She was a dermatologist. And so I kind of knew I wanted to go into medicine. And then, you know, mid to late 80s, kind of started seeing how medicine was already changing. And my local dentist out in Minnesota, which is where I was living at the time when I went to high school, he would ride up on a Harley in a tie-dye shirt and Birkenstocks. And I'm like, I want that job. I want the job that I could do that in. Right? He worked 4 days a week, had a nice house, nice car, took vacations. And so I looked at it from the standpoint really of what kind of job allows me to have the lifestyle I want and a nice life-work balance of being able to enjoy life. I was watching, even my aunt, who was a dermatologist, she'd be on call a lot. And I had other friends that were friends of my family that were physicians where, they'd be spending sometimes 50, 60 hours a week. They're on call, had to go in regularly, work the hospital, that kind of stuff. I'm like, that doesn't sound fun to me. I wanted something that allowed me to really enjoy life as well as the work that I was doing. And so then I went to college and actually did early admission at the University of Minnesota. So I only did 3 years. I better be doing dentistry because I have no other degree. I have trained to do nothing else. If I don't do dentistry, I'm going to go back to school, which I don't think I have the fortitude for that anymore.
Outside of anybody's mouth, you have no idea what's going on.
No idea. I have zero skill sets. And so, I did 3 years and got into dental school.
I was going to say, it felt like that. I remember in dental school and I went the full 4-year and 4-year undergrad, so it didn't fast track like you, but I was parking cars as a valet the week before I graduated. And we're all out there, dental students that are valet parking cars because that's where you need to make an extra buck. And we were like, this is really what we could do. Like, our profession could be parking cars. Next week we can be dentists. So it's like there's
Right.
nothing else we are qualified to do.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, so I went to University of Minnesota and graduated, and then really actually fell in love with it. As I was even in dental school, I enjoyed what I was doing. I like the people part of it. You know me, I love to talk, and people still have their family dentist. Not that people have their family doctor anymore. They go to whatever clinic they're in. You know, sometimes they'll see the same person, sometimes they'll see a nurse practitioner, you know, and I like the autonomy of having my own workspace where I could kind of do what I wanted.
Now, you
And
said you saw what was happening in medicine, because I kind of felt the same way when I was thinking about medicine
yeah,
or dentistry. Do you feel like dentistry is doing the same thing medicine did? Is dentistry changing now?
it's definitely changing. I think it's not changing the way medicine did. I think it's definitely consolidating without a doubt. Groups like the one we just merged with, are
Right.
definitely the wave of the future. The small practice, I think in the future, you're going to see maybe 3, maybe 4 kinds of dental practices. You'll have your FQHCs and your tribal clinics and your Medicaid clinics, right? Your federally funded healthcare centers and that kind of stuff, right? You'll have a few small private practices in predominantly rural areas where the larger groups just aren't going to go any day soon.
Yeah.
And and then there'll be the real boutique high end like cosmetic style practices where they're all fee for service. They're just doing, big cases, and that's their lifeline is the big cases. And then you'll have the group practices, because the others just aren't the traditional model of dentistry. I think is going to be harder and harder to pull off. And unless you're in a small town where the overhead and cost of living and everything is really low, or the high end practices that are charging, $3,000-$4,000 a veneer kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then they have QHCs where you're just working on federal money. Those are going to be the most ones that are survivable outside of a group environment, because the small practices in cities are going to get eaten up by just the marketplace. You've seen it. The workforce is harder to get. The supplies are getting more expensive. You can't find half the stuff half the time.
Yeah, definitely need a partner of some sort,
Yeah.
some type of consolidation,
And whether
whatever that looks like.
whether that is getting a buying group to help you get supplies in a decent fashion, whether that is, joining a group, or just even forming your own group of a couple of docs just to help ease the burden of it. It's just getting harder and harder to manage the practice. I've been doing dentistry now 25 years, and the face of how things were done in that time frame from a business standpoint, obviously clinically stuff has changed drastically.
Right.
But even the way things are done business wise are vastly different. Back then there were very few groups, and the workforce is changing. There's a lot more part-time dentists in dentistry now than there were before. And that's made it so there's an access issue as far as having enough dentists out there in the field. And then of course, hygiene shortages and everything else. You need somebody to help you kind of manage that environment that's out there now for dentistry.
Now, when you went to school in Minnesota, did you grow up in Minnesota?
Yep. Yes, I did.
And then
mostly, I grew up all over the place. I was actually born in Red Wing, Minnesota, and I lived all over the place. I lived in Alabama for a little bit. I lived in Kansas for a while. I lived in Michigan for a little bit. I lived in Spokane, Washington, and I moved back to Minnesota. Yeah, that was all before 8th grade.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was all before 8th grade even. My dad was a engineer, and he never wanted to sit behind a desk. So when they told him he had to sit behind a desk and design stuff, he's like, "Okay, fine, I'm going. I'm gonna go find someplace I can build."
Find somewhere else.
Yeah, he wanted to build power plants, so he built power plants all over the country.
I love it.
So yeah, I finished up high school and college in Minnesota, and then went to dental school there.
And then you started practicing there out of school, correct?
Yeah, I was there for 7 years. I moved out to Oregon in 2004.
Or why did you pick Oregon? Coos Bay.
Actually, my parents retired out here, and I was the only one with grandkids. And so I was in Minnesota working for a group practice. When I got out of dental school, I figured, I wanted to get some experience. So I joined a group where I could have plenty of patients and have some experienced doctors to bounce ideas off of. You remember it was like you get out for the first week, you're like, I don't even know which direction this thing spins correctly, let alone what to do with the tooth with it. And so I wanted to have the option to ask questions and have somebody help me and kind of mentor me along. And, you can do that in a private practice if you find somebody who wants to do that. But in a large group practice, everybody's there. And so we had one guy who specialized in kind of cosmetic work, and another guy who's really good at endo, and another guy who did a lot of extractions. Like I learned to do wisdom teeth extractions from one of the partners of this old group I was in. He came in and I brought a friend of mine in who needed wisdom teeth extracted. He's like, I'll show one side and then you can do the other side. I was like, okay. So that's how there's a lot of that kind of stuff, just a nice mentorship ability. And I worked for them for 7 years, but then kind of saw the writing on the wall. They were getting ready to sell out to a venture capitalist group. And that a lot of times when that happens, it changes the environment of the company very quickly. And so I decided to bail on it. And when I had to leave, my non-compete clause kept me out of the Twin Cities. And that was the only reason I really stayed in Minnesota, is because I love the Twin Cities. Otherwise, it's a barren wasteland and cold as hell. So I'm like, get out. I'm going to get out of here. And thought I could only go as far west as Colorado. So I looked at Colorado, and then found out I could move to Oregon, and I did not have to take a new board exam. I could just do licensure by credential. And my parents were out here already. And so I went and I came out and visited them, and found out I could do that I could come here without having to retake a board exam. And I was looking at the I-5 corridor and, the big cities. And then I went, I remember back when I was just getting out of school, we had a guy come in and lecture to us in our little patient care groups.
Yeah.
And he was a small town dentist. He was about probably 100 miles away from the cities. And he was telling us about what his job was like and how he lived. And he was making more money at that time than anybody I knew of in the big cities, because he wasn't on any of the Delta Premier lists or PPO lists. Because like, man, if you don't want to come to me, that's fine. The next guy's 90 miles away. Have fun driving. And so, basically by just being the only guy in town, he was able to kind of control his lifestyle and charge what he wanted and do work as he wanted. He did a lot of specialty work, which I was always entertained with anyway, doing more, not just drill, fill, and bill, and not just crown and bridge, but all the specialty stuff.
Right.
And so just in talking with him, I went, God, that makes sense. And so I started looking at the rural areas, and my parents were already out in Coos Bay. And I looked at the demographics of the dentists that were here, and they were all like, I moved here in 2004. So that's 19 years ago, and I'm 51 now. So I was 32, and I was the second youngest dentist. There was one guy younger than me by like 2 years. And then everybody else was older. And the next closest was about 15 years older than me. And so I'm like, this is perfect. Most of these guys are going to retire in the next 5 years. And sure enough, within like 5 years, most of them retired. So as they retired, I just they tried to sell their practice, and they would sell. Some sold, some literally just shut their doors. They had more money in rentals and stuff like that, so they didn't really worry about it.
Yeah.
And so as these other practices closed down, the patients just kind of went out to the ether, and we picked them up along the way by developing being here and the way we marketed ourselves and kind of presented ourselves to the community. Because you can in a small town, it's easy.
Yeah. Now, do you have time to interact very much with the community? You're traveling so much, lecturing and speaking all the time.
Well, when I first moved here, so in 2004, I moved here, and I was very involved. I was in the Rotary, I was in Boys and Girls Club, I was in all these groups. And I was also a new doctor in town. And in a small town, that means one thing: you're going to get targeted for every single fundraiser that ever happens.
Of course, yep.
They've already exhausted all the other doctors who've been here for 20 years. They're like, we've tapped these guys dry. So let's get this new guy. He'll come give us money. And so I was invited to all these auctions and everything. And so we'd sponsor baskets or whatever it was, the Christmas tree at the Christmas tree party kind of thing. So for the first, because I didn't start teaching until 2009, really. I did a couple of small things in like 07, 08. So I bought my CEREC in 06, became a mentor. What was that? 08, I think it was. 2008, I think is when the mentor started, or 2009. And that was about the same time I started doing trainings in Oregon, because it was right when the Blue Cam came out, is when they changed the deal where before with Red Cam, they had just a couple of localized centers. Like you had to go down to, like when I got mine, I had to fly all the way down to San Jose and get trained down in San Jose. And then I flew to Cleveland to get another class. And then I went down to LA to see, actually that's and LA is the first time I met Sam. I went down, he was still teaching in LA down at El Segunda. I took his 2-day course down there. And
That was the red
You know,
cam then,
that was
correct?
the old red cam
Yeah.
days. Yeah.
Which I'm glad I'm
Red,
glad you guys experimented and figured things out, because I started as soon as blue cam came out
yeah.
after it got a little easier.
Blue cam was a lot easier. And then Omni, of course, and Prime Scan just jumped up even more. But so I was working for most of that time just by myself. And then the guy that I bought the practice from still worked for like 5 years after I purchased half of it. So I bought half for the first 5 years. And then the second half after he retired, I paid him for the other half. And so when he was still working, he kind of just referred stuff to me. He did crown and bridge, fillings, and extractions. That's all he did. He didn't do endo. He didn't do cosmetics. He didn't do any of that kind of stuff. And so he basically referred all that stuff to me. And then, which works out great because he didn't have to send it out. We're in a small town. We didn't have an endodontist. We had an oral surgeon, a periodontist. That was about it. And so, I was ended up doing some of the specialty work for actually some of the other doctors in town. They actually would refer their endo to me because my partner's like, yeah, my new doctor that I've got with me, he loves endo. He'll do yours. So they start referring him to me. I'm like, okay, I said I liked endo. I didn't like doing 4 of them a day, for God's sakes. But that's what ended up happening, which actually when I started out was great because, low overhead with endo. I do 4 endo.
Right.
Like, well, we were sharing a front desk. We were sharing the office. So I'm like, my overhead was like 35, 40%. And there's days I go, why did I ever change that? It was like me and 2 people and 40% overhead. I'm like, I could be doing work half as much and still make the same amount. But it was, so when I moved here, I wasn't traveling as much. That started. And then when I did start traveling, it was like once a month up to Portland to teach basic training.
Yeah.
And then it was around 2012 that things really started picking up. That was when there were some changes, like Sam wasn't traveling anymore. Scramstead wasn't traveling anymore. And so what ended up happening then is they needed somebody to go do all these Ivoclar events that Ivoclar was planning. And so that's how me and Rich and Jules started doing so many of them together. And that's when I started traveling, 15, 20 weekends a year. And then it got up to the worst one I had was like 26 weekends. I was gone half the weekends. And after that year, I went, I think it's time to back off a little bit and not travel so much. And so that's when I started backing off a little bit.
Now you do love teaching, though. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
So just the traveling, I'm sure, gets old, but
yeah. Well, because at that time, living in Coos Bay, it's almost the farthest point west on the continental United States. Like the farthest point is only a little bit south of us. And the airport we have isn't real convenient. It flies once a day down to San Francisco. And so I was teaching in Charlotte a lot of times with Rich doing the accept programs. And so I would leave my house either the night before and stay in a hotel. I would take the 5 or 6 o'clock flight out of Eugene. And if I was flying Delta, I flew Delta to Salt Lake City to Atlanta, and then Atlanta to Charlotte. And I'd land at like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. I've been traveling all day in an airport, in an airplane.
Right.
And then I'd get there and I have to be at the center at the lecture the next day at like 7:30. And I'd lecture for 2 days and then fly back. This was Friday, Saturday. So I'd fly back Saturday. And then I'd have Sunday with the kids. Or if I couldn't get a Saturday flight, I'd fly back Sunday, have Sunday with the family, work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, fly out Thursday for a Friday, Saturday lecture again. So that's when I'm like, okay, this is nuts. I'm spending half my time either on a plane or in a lecture and half my time in the clinic and barely. Now, I had a nice window in there because my oldest child had graduated college or high school by that point, and we have a 7-year age gap. So at that time, my youngest was what, like 11 or 12, and my parents live here. So she got to spend the weekends at grandma's house if Cece came with me. So she wasn't really bummed about it because she got to spend time at grandma's house. Which was great because then also these kids grew up with their grandparents right next door.
Well, that is cool. Now, and you and Cece, you're together a lot when you're traveling. Were you able to make that work most of the time?
Yeah, most of the time. I would say probably half the time Cece came with me because, again, my parents lived 3 miles from my house. And in the wintertime, my mother-in-law would come and stay in the property I had out here. I had a 2-bedroom apartment above my shop. She would stay there in the wintertime because she was from northern Minnesota. Because people always ask, like, why are you coming to Oregon, the rainy coast of Oregon for winter? She's like, I'm from Minnesota. They'd be like, oh, never mind. I get it.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. We figured that. It makes sense. And so she would come stay with us for 6 months, and she was like 30 yards from the house. So it was really easy. The kids could literally just stay in their house. Grandma would watch them. CC come with me.
Perfect.
And then actually about a quarter to a third of the time, the kids would come with me as well.
Oh, nice.
So like a lot of the guys like Rich and Jewel, those are like Rich's Uncle Richie to my girls because they saw him so much. We've gone to concerts with them. We've gone vacationing with them. So
Yeah.
it got to the point where they knew the family well enough that was just part of what they did now. So they would hang out at the CDocs. We'd go to do a lecture and then there'd be the happy hour afterwards. My little kids are like running around, like talking to all the adults, just having conversations with them like they're just supposed to be there.
Right. So if somebody wanted to get into teaching or speaking, what advice would you give them?
So it depends on what you want to speak about, obviously, but the best thing to do is if you want to get into speaking on clinical stuff, probably the best way to go about it is you talk to your local distributors because they're always looking for people to do presentations. Talk to the reps. You know, if you use a certain product, like let's say you do composites and you really like Ivoclar's composite. So talk to your composite, your Ivoclar rep, chat with them because they always want to have local people because there's the big guys that do this stuff and they're expensive. And sometimes they just want a local study club where they can pay somebody a few $1,000s or, you know, so hell, when I started, sometimes it was like, here, have some CEREC blocks and a dinner. Okay, great.
Right,
sure. I'll drive 4
us.
hours I'll come drive 4 hours to Portland for a couple of blocks and a dinner. That sounds great.
Right.
You know, and so some of it is, and that's also part of it. Sometimes most of the time, you're going to have to start with, you know, you'll pay your dues a little bit. You're going to go do a dinner meeting for like 5 people and talk about composites or talk about surgery, you know. It really just depends on what you want to talk about. So the reps are a good way, whether it's through your distributor or through a manufacturer. If let's say you're doing implants, again, the reps are always looking for KOLs to kind of explain their product. And so if you've got somebody if you're placing implants, talk to your implant reps. That's how you kind of work your way up there because ultimately the people who you generally pay for large CE stuff is the manufacturers or the distributors until you've made such a name for yourself where you can kind of do it where you can go now they know who I am. So now I can say, hey, come pay me, you know, X number of dollars or I'll run a class. Or the other thing is, or you make a name for yourself and instead of going places, you set up a center like, you know, James Clem has, or like originally that's how CEREC Doctors started CEREC Doctors started by teaching classes in LA and they set the website up and then they started doing more, they had hands-on courses there, but then they moved to Scottsdale and that's when things really blew up.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious. I want to talk a little bit about the transition you had when you bought your practice. So you worked there with the dentist for about 5 years. You bought half the practice to start with.
Yep.
How did that work from your standpoint? Because I see that as a pretty good model from a selling dentist standpoint. I could grandfather in, I could slowly retire. But as an associate coming in, what was that like from your perspective?
So mine was pretty easy because the owner doctor at that time, I came in and I bought the practice from, but he wasn't really retiring. So he didn't like hand over a bunch of patients. So I kind of started by building my own practice inside of his, but he was referring the stuff he didn't want to do or was already referring out, like all of his endo. Anybody who wanted posterior composites or cosmetic work, he didn't do any of that kind of stuff. So he really just had his lane that he was really happy in. And that's probably harder.
His amalgam lane.
Right. He was his amalgam lane. And man, dude could slick teeth though. He could extract teeth as good as any oral surgeon I've ever seen. And so he loved to do that stuff. But the downside was, and what most people find is the downside is if the retiring doctor doesn't want to give up if he's still working full tilt, that's hard because, you know, if it's somebody like you or me who does everything, well, what do I want to give away? My posterior composites. I don't want to be chained to a chair doing posterior composites, right? Here, you can have all the, you know, upper second molar root canals. You know, that's what burns an associate out. So you have to, if you're going to go that route, you have to make sure that the doc that you're mentoring with is going to be willing to kind of give up some of the juicy stuff. They have to be willing to give up the cool stuff. And ideally, kind of what I've got now going with the way I'm me working just a limited amount of time is my associate does most of the bread and butter stuff and I handle the big cases. He doesn't like doing large cases. He doesn't do anything over like onesie twosies in the back. He's perfectly happy doing bread and butter dentistry. He does implants and stuff, but he doesn't do pretty much any root canals. And his implants are pretty much green light ones. Although I had him trained to do sinus lifts and he's feeling comfortable doing that stuff. But he doesn't do like full mouth rehabs. He doesn't do all on X's. He doesn't do large cosmetic cases. So any cases like that, come to me, which works out great. So if I show up, it's a big case. It's kind of more entertaining than just going in and doing, another second molar crown for the 8th time today. And so they're more challenging and interesting. But with the phasing out, like you're asking about, it worked out really well because he was wanting to taper off. And so he was dumping a lot of more stuff onto me than I would think normally would happen if the doctor isn't in that mode.
And you were 50-50 partners for those 5 years?
Yeah, basically.
And how did the decision making go?
Yes and no, because actually what we did, so that was a little more different because I bought it and I was sharing charts with him and everything. He had one front desk and one hygienist. There was only a 4-chair clinic. And he worked Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I worked Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to start. And then what ended up occurring was, so we overlap a little bit during the week, but not much. And I split the cost of his front desk person who was working 5 days a week. And eventually I split the cost of his hygienist. So I basically paid for half a front desk and half a hygienist for 5 years. When I first started, I was doing my own hygiene even. So basically, I was getting some of the patients because patients would call up and they'd be like, well, we can't see Dana, but Dr. O'Bryan can see you. He'd do your cleaning. So then they come in and I'd do their cleanings. And that was for probably, that was a good year or more that I was doing that before I actually started splitting time. Because then he backed down to 2 days. And then I was taking the other 3. So he would do Monday, Tuesday. I'd work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And he wasn't in the office really at all anymore. So then I started seeing some of his patients. And that just fueled the practice even more. And the hygienist picked up an extra day. So I was doing 2 days of her and she'd see the other doctors 2 days. But
now on the flip side, now fast forward where you're at now, you have practicing with you. Is it your cousin, your nephew? I can't remember.
My brother-in-law.
Oh, not even close.
No, Cece's brother, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Cece's brother's my associate.
And so he's been practicing with you for a number of years.
About 3 now. He was my associate out of dental school. When he got out of dental school, he was a late starter. He did a whole bunch of traveling when he was younger and taught English overseas a number of years, and then came back and went to dental school and graduated in 2010. But he's only 3 years younger than me. So he's been out, 13 years now, but he's 47, 48.
Okay.
Right.
And so it was when you brought him on, were you thinking something like, were you thinking I'm going to taper? Was that the original plan, or what were you thinking retirement wise?
Well, mine wasn't really planned so much as I had been getting I tried to get an associate from when I was traveling. So I wanted somebody just part-time. This is around 2006, 2007 that I started. The first guy did not work out well. I had to fire him in the first month. That didn't pan out well. The second guy stayed for about 6 months, and he had a whole bunch of family stuff going on and a lot of family turmoil. And he was having some health issues. And so that one didn't work out either. But right before he started with me, or about the time he started with me, I actually got diagnosed with degenerative disc disease in my neck and stenosis. And so I actually ended up having to back off because as I started working, when I was working full time, it started with just a little bit of pain in my neck, a little twinge, a little hot spot. I'm like, Thursday, my neck's a little sore, it's a little stiff. By after the weekend, it'd be fine. And then all of a sudden, it's like Wednesday morning, it's sore. And then it wouldn't get really all better by the end of the weekend. And then Tuesday roll around, and now it's sore on Tuesday, and it wasn't better by the next week. It was still stiff and sore. And so I went in and got it checked because I'm like, I need to have a baseline. My worry is that something was happening. I need to see what it is now. And then in 3 years, it's worse. I've got it documented. And the orthopedic guy who came out, who did the spine stuff in my town, looks at me and goes, you've got no discs between 5, 6, and 7. Your spine's touching. Are you or your spinal column's touching? Like,
oh man.
He's like, are you sure you're not having any pain? I'm like, no numbness. I'm like, not that I can tell. Turns out, I was having numbness. I was blaming it on my hand falling asleep because I was laying on it until I realized the arm that was falling asleep was always the one I wasn't actually laying on. It was the one that was free and clear. And so then I started tracking it. And so I ended up having to back off practicing. And
So what's that like? I mean, emotionally, what's going on when you're finding out, oh, my Nick is messed up?
well, it was a little, I was basically, I was at the top of my game. I was as good as I've ever been. And all of a sudden I can't practice as much. And so it's one of those things that, I guess the example I always used to give was it would kind of be like, not to say I'm Tom Brady, but it'd be like being Tom Brady and you can only play the first quarter. And after that, you got to sit out because you're going to hurt yourself. Right.
Yeah.
And this guy's gone for how many years of playing football because he could. And all of a sudden I can't do what I love to do and I'm good at. And all of a sudden I can only do a quarter to a third of what I could used to do and it's weird because when I, even today, so this has been going on for like 5 years now. This is 2017, 2018, this happened.
Yep.
And so it's been 5 years. And what ends up happening is even to this day, I'll work like a day and I'm like, oh man, I'm feeling good. I could do this more often. So then I load myself up. I'll do an extra day here. I'll do an extra day there. And then by the third day, I'm like, this was a huge mistake. All of a sudden I'll have nights where if I do that, there was a time when Jesse, my associate, went on vacation. And so I'm like, oh, I'll just cover his schedule. I'll just work the 4 days. My arm, I literally woke up 12 times one night because my hands fell asleep when I was sleeping all night. And then, so it was a little rough because, I'm really passionate about dentistry and about what I do. And, I love seeing my patients. Half of them, I'm seeing their grandkids and great grandkids now. In a small town where everybody sticks around, you see the same people all the time. I've got there's probably 4 or 5 families. I have 4 generations in the family right now.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I'm having to hand these people off to somebody else. And now granted, it's my brother-in-law, which is great, but it's still not me. And it's hard to let go. And I see why when a doctor wants to sell, he's like, I'm done with this. I want to be done. It either gets really hard to let go and it causes friction with the associate, or the buyer in this case, if they've sold, or they go, I can't do this at all. I'm out. And they just all of a sudden bail. Like, I'll be here for a couple of years and then 3 months and they're like, I'm out. See ya. Not doing it anymore. Yeah. It's hard to watch what you grew for so many years change when you don't have the control over it.
Yeah.
And you have to let go of all of that, especially with people who are, kind of entrepreneurial by nature and they like having their control. They like having the ability to say, this is how I want to do stuff. And when you let go, if you have to let go of that, somebody else takes the reins and starts telling you what to do. It's a lot harder to do than that. And when it was forced upon me, especially, that was tough. Like I didn't have, I did have a choice. I could have kept working. And then I would have been that guy who can't turn around and, he's just stiff necked and he can't turn his neck past 10 degrees, or I'm having to have surgery and I'm in constant pain. And so I chose the point of, and I'm, that's usually not my MO. I'm not usually the brightest one about limiting myself for especially physical stuff where I'm like, oh, I can do that. And then I pay for it repeatedly. This is one of the times I actually listened to it. My wife and I had some very serious conversations about it. And it was about, okay, can I back off and keep my sanity first off? Financially, luckily I was fine. My disability was set up such since I got out of dental school that financially it didn't matter. I was doing fine. Right. Not a problem at all there. That was probably even the harder part because I could have just walked away. I could have walked away and sat on a beach somewhere and done nothing and still gotten paid pretty close to about half to a third to 3/4 of what I was making when I was working full time and had no stress and anything else, but I wasn't ready to be done. And so by having the ability to bring somebody in and still see the cases I really want to and still see the patients I really want to. Now, granted, I feel sorry for my associates sometimes because anybody who comes in and starts giving me a red flag being a pain in the ass, guess who he goes, you should really see Dr. Gridley. He's great with these kind of cases.
Amazing.
He's amazing with rowdy kids. It's fantastic. Yes, they cry a lot. He's great with kids.
Specializes in that.
Right. He loves doing stainless steel crowns on young squirming kids.
So you got that figured out. You have Jesse helping you out. You kind of figured out your sweet spot, how much time you can work. So why you and I had a conversation, this last summer, we were both kicking the can at different consolidation opportunities out there. And we were talking a lot about it because it was a conversation we would not have even thought about having 5 or 10 years ago because they
Oh
were
God,
just,
no.
that was a dirty word. But
Right.
now,
You would never join a group. Oh my God,
right.
a corporate practice.
Yeah, it was just the evil corporate practice. So now I think, I mean, obviously the culture's changed, and I think the DSO model has evolved enough where there's some options out there that aren't all so bad. But
Oh, agreed.
yeah. So anyway, what prompted you to start looking?
So what originally prompted me to start looking was when I got disabled and I wasn't able to work much. I'd lost my other associate because of other health issues, which also kind of made me go, all right, I need to have a backup plan because I could wake up tomorrow. Like I was being able to, at that time I was doing when my other associate left before Dr. Gridley came down and helped out. What happened was I was in the clinic doing hygiene checks 5 days a week because we'd had the schedules going. I'm like, I can't bail on thousands of patients all of a sudden. So I was doing hygiene checks 3 days a week and doing only operative 2 days a week. So I was in the clinic more often than I was any time in my life. And I was making actually less money than I was before. So I was burning out really, really fast. And so when Jesse came on, he said, I can definitely give you 3 years, maybe 5. He goes, I just don't know if this is where I want to stay, but I can help get you out of a bind. I'm like, okay, cool. That's fine. So then I'm like, well, I'm in Coos Bay. If he's only gonna be here 3 years, I kind of need to start looking pretty soon. Because
Right.
I feel like it'll take me. I mean, I run a good practice, but I run a good practice in the middle of nowhere. Right. It's not, we're 2 hours from the nearest Target, for God's sakes. And, people are like, it's a hard sell to get people to a small area. And this, I mean, up in Clement
Right.
Falls,
Yep.
it's not much
You
better.
bet.
It's hard places to get associates, hard places to get staff. And so I was like, it's going to take at least a year or more to find somebody. And then if it's a private buy, then now I'm going to have to stick around. I want to stick around and transition them and probably have to mentor them if they're a new grad. They're not going to
Yep.
be ready to. One new grad's going to come in and be like, okay, well, I'm ready to do implants and endo and sinus lifts and full mouth extractions and all this sort of stuff. I'm going to have to train them, not train them up, but kind of mentor them up to get to this level where otherwise, if I sail and walk, it's like, okay, you just lost $400,000 in production you won't be able to do because you can't do these things right now. And
Yeah.
so to keep them on, so I figured again, if I'm locked in for 3 years, or I have a 3-year window, I need to start looking pretty soon to make sure the transition can happen. And so I started looking a little bit. I just went to a regular old practice transition person, and for the life of me, I couldn't even remember their name right now. I don't remember who the hell I used, to be honest. And so I was doing that, and this was right before COVID kind of hit. So this is mid 2019, roughly.
Uh-huh.
And because Jesse had come down and started working with me in August of 2019. And so it might have been actually, it probably was right at the beginning of 2020, right before COVID hit. So yeah. So I put it on the market. And within actually like 3 to 4 months, I actually had 3 people interested in it. One of them was MB2. One of them was Signature Dental, and the other was a private person who was interested.
Uh-huh.
And the other 2 were like MB2 and the private person didn't actually have like an offer, but they were inquiring about it. And then Signature actually came to the office. They flew out to the middle of Coos Bay and checked out the office and wanted to make me an offer. And they're not a bad group. There was nothing wrong with them. The problem was because they were looking at the numbers. Part of the thing was when they looked at the numbers, it was right when I got disabled and I had problems with associates. So the numbers went from, really nice to kind of tanking for a little while.
Yep.
And so that was down. So the offer was good considering that it was actually about 110 to 115% of my collections was what they offered me. So it was a decent deal. Right. And I was ready to walk down. Wasn't even just walking down the aisle. Like I was at the aisle, the ring was on the finger, and the last minute I ripped it off the finger and threw it away. And so, because there was a couple things that were happening that I didn't like the feel of. I'd seen a transition with private equity groups before. When I was in a group practice back in Minnesota, when I first got out of school, I actually became a partner in this group. We had 20 practices back then. So we were basically and they had a management company. Excuse me. I've been fighting this chest stuff forever. we had a management company that was half owned by Delta Dental. And the management company really was where the money was. The practices generated the money, but the real like growth was the management side. And they were looking to switch to private equity. Private equity companies were starting to look at them, and they started all of a sudden coming in going, you should really only do buildups on root canal teeth. Not everybody needs a cleaning every 6 months. Not everybody. I mean, they were starting to do that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, I saw the writing on the wall that they started restricting our buying power. Here's the products you have to use now. Here's the formulary. Before, we could kind of use whatever we wanted. We had special deals with some of the vendors. Obviously, 3M gave us a better deal because I was in Minnesota. Go figure. And so we had better deals than a lot of them. But they started literally saying, like, you should really do this instead, like telling us how to treat a patient now.
Yeah.
And at that point, I'm like, I'm out. I don't.
So you saw what happened with this change, and you're kind of worried about that. Again.
And when I started seeing something, because we were in the, we're finishing the process, we were doing some of the onboarding stuff, and they allowed me. I was talking to them. They said, "Yeah, you can totally keep your Patterson rep." I'm like, "Cool." And then one day we're sitting in the office and like, have you looked at Shine? Like, have you really looked at Shine? And I'm like, I haven't even signed my papers yet, and you're trying to tell me I should switch. As soon as the ink's dry, it's not going to be a tell it's not going to be an ask anymore. It's going to be a tell. And so I'm like, that doesn't sound good to me. And actually, there was some insurance stuff I did that, because where we are, the insurance they had, the nearest provider was in Eugene, 2 hours away. Like, there were no providers in my neighborhood in our entire town. And so that was another potential problem, because I had one of my staff members actually having some really big health issues at that time. And I'm like, I can't bail on these people right now, even though I could have taken the money and walked and been done. But this is the staff that's been my family for years. And so I couldn't just bail on them. So at that point, I walked away. And also what happened was post-COVID, we saw a big uptick. And so all of a sudden, I was mapping out, if we continued the production we had for the last 4 months, because we got delayed. We got delayed because of the PPP loan. The PPP loan delayed the closing by like 4 months. And as I watched the numbers come in for those 4 months,
you're like, we're worth more, and we're going to be worth more in another 2 years.
We were going to do 50% more that year than we did the year prior.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, that's no. So we went back and I started saying, look, this is way more than we talked about. They weren't willing to renegotiate it, so I ended up walking.
Now, which is, fortuitous, because you got a really good, I think, fit. You and I both, joined Imagine. And for you, in what you want to do, that's giving you, you got a great partner. You can continue practicing. Someone's going to help if Jesse decides he wants to move. Someone's going to help you get somebody else in there. And you can keep doing what you're doing. So it's actually a really nice fit.
It works out well for me. Also, the transition's done. So if tomorrow I can't practice, it's still taken care of, and nothing's going to change. If all of a sudden I had to fire sale that thing, somebody's going to come in, buy it, kick Jesse out, change everything for the staff, and God only knows what happens. Now, if I walk away tomorrow, or have to walk away from practicing, but that's the other nice thing is the way it's done is, if I don't practice, with a private equity, if I'm not practicing, I have to sell my equity. I have to walk away from the practice. I may be able to go do something corporate, but I'm kind of done doing that. With Imagine, they're flexible enough. They said, you, as long as you're still, kind of managing the practice, it's still your practice, even if you've got just nothing but associates. And then we'll find something else, I can do education for them or what have you. There's all sorts of things that can be done down the road within the company to still keep me engaged as long as I want to be.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, what are you excited about in dentistry right now? What are you most excited about?
Oh gosh. Besides Imagine, honestly, besides the transition and what's going on there.
Is that kind of really what's got you jazzed right now?
It does right now. Yeah. Because it's still new for me. I mean, you just joined, and I joined in October. Hasn't even been 6 months for me yet, or it's just right at 6 months, I think. And so for me, it's really just kind of delving into the culture and seeing what opportunities are within the group, within not only my own, my own practice is kind of running a thing. It's clicking along pretty good. But what can I do to help the other practices that are going to come up in Oregon? What about other practices within Imagine in general? I mean, I am going to go get my sedation training finally. I'd always thought about doing it, but then once I got injured, I'm like, well, I'm not going to be working as much. And then I don't know why, but I was using a nurse anesthetist down in our area. And then I can't get anybody down here anymore. Nobody will come down to sedate patients when I'm doing like my big cases.
Yep.
And so I'm like, well, fine, I'll just get my sedation license myself. And then I started thinking about it. I don't know how it took so long for me to think of this. I'm like, I could do sedation for other offices and it won't hurt my neck. I don't know why I didn't think of that any sooner, but it literally took me 5 years to figure it out. And so now with Imagine, that's the thing is with something like Imagine, I've got an instant, if anybody needs somebody sedated, I'll go sedate their patients for them.
Yeah.
I've got a group I can work in that within. And also I've got a license in Arizona too. So I might also like fly down and do a couple of offices down there if they need somebody to sedate them.
Yeah.
Just hang down. And if they don't do implants, fine, I'll sedate them and do their implants for them. So that's the other thing is I guess it kind of helps me be sort of the specialist for a couple of different offices. Maybe we've got an office that doesn't like doing implants, but they're referring them out. Well, if they can keep it in-house, all the better for them.
Yeah, you can do it. I love that.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, this has been awesome. I love visiting, and I love talking Imagine. I love talking implants. That's all my language, so that's good stuff.
Right. It's my favorite stuff.
Yeah. If somebody wants to see what you're up to, if they want to take a class, how can they find you?
So I'm always at CDocs. I teach courses down there, predominantly the cone beam course, but you can always reach me on CDocs at cdocs.com. The email's easy. It's O'Bryan, Obryan at cdocs.com. Otherwise, I'm available on social media a little bit. I'm a horrible social media person though. I'm so bad at it. It's like if I don't go on a trip, I don't really post much. So mostly through CDocs or through Imagine. And then it's just O'Bryan at imaginedentalpartners.com. Those are the places that reach me the most. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
I love it. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate you doing this.
Thanks, Mark. It was absolutely fun.
This episode of the Better Dental Life podcast was brought to you by Better Dental Life. When you are ready to transform your life, transform your practice, and expand your income, become a member of Better Dental Life. You can find out more about us at betterdentallife.com. Make sure to search for the Better Dental Life podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, and click subscribe so you never miss an episode. On behalf of the team here at Better Dental Life, thank you for listening.